I work as a professor of archaeology at Linnaeus University in Sweden, and I have really broad research interest. But in terms of futures literacy and futures thinking, I'm very involved in what we call a UNESCO share on heritage futures that is with us at Linnaeus University, and there we with research on heritage processes and futures making. So what we are interested in is how heritage is used in society to create various futures. And those futures could be like including a lot of people, or they could exclude a lot of people, and they can be very positive and they can be very negative. There are a lot of definitions of futures literacy, and actually I would like to talk about futures literacies in the plural term to acknowledge the multiple versions of futures thinking that exists all over the world. But I mean, futures thinking, it involves the consideration and sort of exploration of a range of futures that might be possible in the present, and the implication of engaging with long-term perspectives to look at various possibilities. If we think about the future as within 10 minutes, the future will hopefully be very similar to our present now. But if we extend that future thinking for 5 or 10 or 15 or 50 or 100 years into time, the only thing we know about the future is that it will actually be very different compared to today. If we look at the long-term perspective, as I do as an archaeologist, the only thing that is constant over time is variation. And having that knowledge, it's likely that it will also be so in the future. And then future thinking, it will help us to open up our minds to understand that the future will be different, and then help us understand how we in the present can embrace uncertainty and multiple futures to sort of make better futures for ourselves in the present. And in that sense, futures literacy, it is both a theoretical concept, but also a capacity that every person have, every human has the futures literacy, but it can be developed by engagement and by knowledge and by practical exploration. And it involves capacities to envision multiple potential futures that are some ways or another different compared to the sort of mainstream future thinking that we in our part of the world are engaged in. So we say that what we have now, we should not have in the future. We should change that. Or what we have now, we should keep in the future, just to make it simple. And we find that in politics, but we also find it in ways of setting up society. So, for example, these are values that we have today that is important that we have in the future as well. So we constantly engage with the future, but we rarely envision that future. So when will that future happen? Who will live in it? Who are we actually addressing now when we are talking about the future? When will it happen? Is it in 2 years, 3 years, 4 years, 6 years, 10 years? And how do we think that the actions we take today actually will impact in that future? So what will happen? And as soon as you start asking those questions to, for example, someone who is planning in society, they will look at you with big eyes and say, I've never thought about that. Because they are planning for what they know now and not what will happen in the future. So, or someone is planning for what they think is wrong now and they want to change it. And of course, you should do that. That is how we work. We think something is wrong and we want to improve it. But then if you ask those people, okay, if you improve it, when in the future will this have an impact? Is it tomorrow or is it in 10 years? And that impact, what will that actually be? Who will benefit from it? Is it young people? Is it old people? Is it people who live close by in a local community, or is it on a national level? And how do you think that the people who live in that future will understand and actually benefit from the change that you want to make today? So if you start to ask those questions, it doesn't mean that you should just throw away everything you know now and start thinking anew, but it means that you add a layer of complexity to what you're doing and start to ask questions about the future. So we are full of people today who wants to plan for the future to make the future better for future generations, for example. But they rarely ask themselves, what kind of future do future generations want to live in? So instead of planning for a future, you can start to facilitate for future generations to be better in their own futures making. So to me, that is crucial in the world we are living in. As we know little about the future, but there are mega trends we know will come, like for example, climate change and those kind of really big mega trends. And if we want to make a world that where future generations will be better than worse off, it is really important to start to ask these topical questions about what kind of future do we think future generations wants to live in, instead of asking how can we plan for a better future for future generations. We cannot know what the future generations want, and if we try to present them with what we think they want, we will only impose our incapability of thinking about them into them, and we will just, it would be not beneficial for future generations. Instead, we need to think about how can we facilitate for multiple futures to happen in the future so that future generations can benefit from those multiple futures that we have presented. So if we narrow down the future so it is going to happen the way we plan, we reduce the multiple possible futures in the present to happen, and we sort of impose our inabilities to imagine alternative futures to future generations. And then they need not only to act according to their contemporary society and their future aspirations, they also need to act upon our inability to present multiple futures to them. So instead, we need to open up, broaden up, and ask questions like, what is the implications of what I'm doing now for the future, let's say in 5 or 10 or 20 years? Will the thing that I'm doing now, will they facilitate for future generations to act upon their premises, or will it impose them that they need to act upon my understanding? And if we look at history, I mean, if we go back, let's say we only need to go back 50, 60 years in time. If someone did something then that I need to act upon now, it will be a struggle for me, because they act upon what was relevant to them, not relevant to me now. And we see it everywhere. I mean, if we look at the climate issue, for example, that is one topic that we need to act upon previous generations' failure, because they didn't facilitate for us to have an alternative. And now we need to find alternatives. And if we go back, like, say, 500 years in time, which is a huge amount of time, but for an historian and an archaeologist, it's nothing in the millions of years that the Homo species have walked on Earth. So 500 years back in time, it's in 16th century. So if someone told me then to act upon one specific thing now, it would become ridiculous. I would just say, well, no, I won't do that, because that is not relevant. If we make decisions now that are locked in our time and reduce future generations' capacity to act upon their promises, we will actually risk doing harm to future generations. And if it's in the long-term perspective, we will actually become totally irrelevant. So what we are doing is not, it's not something that future generations will act upon because they will just think it's ridiculous. So it's about adding a layer of complexity that opens up for multiple futures to happen. And in doing that, providing future generations the possibilities to act upon what's relevant to them instead of what is relevant to us now. Every course you give at the university, and this is on a PhD level, is sort of set in a pre-concept understanding of that knowledge is good. So it's not instrumental. It's about broadening up your mind, your theoretical mind as part of your education. Because a PhD student is a student. It's an education. So in that sense, it's important because you are in a context where knowledge, new knowledge, theoretical knowledge is important. But what we are also doing with this course is that we try to add a layer of complexity onto what the PhD students already is doing. So we ask them to take their sort of PhD project and then add aspects of futures literacy and anticipation upon it. Very many PhD students are working with topics that are relevant to society today. For example, a decolonial perspective. And in that research, they are working with change. They are working with topics, trying from a historical perspective, finding out why we live in the society we do as today, and then perhaps adding to this, how can we create a new future or a better future? And then this course is trying to inspire the students to see the relations between past, present, and futures in new way. So instead of saying that looking in the sort of rare mirror to the past, they also get the capacity to change that view into a future. So instead of saying that this has been wrong in the past, we need to change it. They also get theoretical tools to understand change in a new way. So, and the implication of change in creating multiple futures. We are all equipped, or sort of, we are all full of futures. As I said, that is what we are. The Homo sapiens is one of the few living creatures on Earth who actually can analyze the past to act upon the present to create new futures. So we are all doing that. We are all full of it. But if we want to do that on a sort of academic level, where we not only do it as every humans, but do it as based on knowledge, new knowledge, on research, we need to equip ourselves with tools to understand how do we do that? What kind of new questions do we need to ask to understand future making processes in the present? So if you think about time, time is compressed in the present. So all the past we know and all our anticipations of the futures are in the present. That is what exists. And the more we equip ourselves with knowledge about the past, the more we are able to vision alternative futures. And the more we equip ourselves with capabilities to envision alternative futures, the more interesting questions we can ask about the past. So it compresses down to this moment we are in now. And that is, you need to equip yourself with research-based knowledge to understand how this plays out in multiple ways. A lot of students, but also people, when I'm presenting this to in different contexts, some come up to me afterwards and say, that was a really mind fuck. And that is what you need, because you need to understand that what you have thought about the future before, you can never think about it in the same way after having this knowledge. You understand that it's more complex than it was before. And it is typical, what we do at universities. We present theoretical knowledge, and then we have seminars, and then we write, and then we comment on our texts and so on. So it's a basic way of teaching this topic. Some of the students we have taught are working in a decolonial perspective, looking as in a global humanities. And some of them are investigating the role of statues in lines of what happened some years ago, when we had a lot of statues of slave owners, for example, and so on, were torn down. And then they do a really good job in investigating why this happened, and what is the historical context, and how does it impact on current society and so on. And then someone would say, like, I think these statues should go. I don't want them here. And then you can start asking why. And then they will reply in a historical sense, because there is a colonial history that impact on society and so on. And then you will say, yes, that's true. But that is not what you are talking about. You are talking about the future. You are saying that you now should make a decision to take away that statue. And in what sense will that impact on the future? So how do you envision the impact of taking away a statue? And then that a lot of students realize that, okay, I've never asked that question, because I want them statues to go because they represent something that is negative, really, really negative. I mean, those people can have killed a lot of people, and I want that to go. And that is understandable. But as soon as I say, I want that statue to go, you are not talking about history, you're talking about the future. Because you are doing something that will impact on the future. And then we try to add knowledge to that, saying, like, okay, if you want that, you need to start doing research on the impact on the future. So how can you envision different futures? What are the scenarios played out in that future? When will that future happen? And for whom will it be beneficial? So that is one way of teaching. It's not the past that limits us, it's our interpretation of the past, our abilities to see multiple pasts in the present. And it's the use of the past in the present that may limit us. So if we take a very urgent topic and currently much discussed, so we are living in a new world, as everyone says, with a war in Europe. And we can see from that heritage institutions and museums are targeted in war. They are destroyed. And that has impact on in our country. So now all museums and other form of heritage institutions or heritage authorities, they are preparing for civil defense and social preparedness. And the government urged the National Heritage Board to develop a group where they together work with this. And what they are doing is urgent and it's needed. But a lot of museums now, so they list artifacts and buildings and so on that are important to protect and preserve. And as I said, it is totally understandable, and it's what they probably should do. But if you add a futures literacy or futures thinking perspective to that, you will immediately understand that you should not preserve what we think is valuable now. You should preserve what you think could be useful after the war, to build a social, sustainable, peaceful society. Because that is the reason we are preserving things. It's not because we like them now, it's because we think they should have value after a war or after any other type of conflict. And it might be that the things we value now, it is also the collections and the houses, old houses and so on, heritage, that will be useful after a war. But it also might be that that is not the case, because we simply don't know, because we haven't given it any thought whatsoever. So that is a typical example, I think, about why future thinking is important. Because in a worst case scenario, you're planning for a devastating war that will have huge consequences on society. So the society will not be the same before and after the conflict. But then you have museums who say that the things we value now, we will also value after the conflict. But if the society will be another society affected by conflict, affected by war, we need to ask the questions, what kind of heritage do we need in a post-conflict world to heal society, to create social sustainability, to create long-lasting peace? To me, it is really important to understand that a deep futures thinking, futures literacy, is not about planning for specific futures to happen. It's about facilitating for multiple futures and enable future generations to act upon their world from their own understanding of their world and in accordance to what makes sense to them and not to us. And sometimes it's the same, but sometimes it's not. And history tells us that the only thing that throughout history that is constant is change. And it likely will be that in the future as well. So then we need to understand that we are the past of the future generations. So future generations will use their past, that is what we are doing, to make sense in their world. And if we limit their abilities to make sense by acting upon the future as it is linear and as it is something that we should plan for, then future generations will have huge difficulties to benefit from what we are doing. Yeah, we have a lot of dictators and a lot of, the whole 20th century full of war, world war, and so on. So that are obvious examples. But more delicate examples are, for example, when the planning of the sort of modern Sweden in the 1930s, 40s, and 50s resulted in very brutal buildings in Swedish cities that are really difficult to make sense of today and handle today. And they thought that they had a real clear understanding of the future, a modern future with modern facilities, modern apartments, and they visualized that by tearing down the whole sort of old city blocks and then placed huge buildings there that we live with today. And we cannot act upon those buildings according to our needs. We need to act upon them based on their needs because they are so manifest. Don't think of the future as something to plan for, and stay curious. It's difficult, but it's worth it.